Because we now know that at that time, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, truly global cataclysmic events involving rapid rises in sea level did occur.
Researchers in Turkey now claim they found indisputable evidence that the story of Noah's Ark was not a cautionary tale about the consequences of forsaking God, but a verifiable historical event.
High in the mountains of eastern Turkey, a strange ship-shaped formation has sparked debate about Noah's Ark for decades.
What in the world would a boat be doing way up there?
Earlier studies only created new questions, so scientists went back and scanned the Durupinar site again, this time with far stronger equipment.
The book of Genesis says Noah landed here, in the mountains of Ararat. So, could this really be Noah's Ark?
What the new scans hinted about a possible link to Noah's Ark surprised even the team.
And suddenly the worldwide tradition of a global flood stops being just a myth and starts being a memory.
And if these findings hold up, what else could be hiding beneath these mountains? The strange boat-shaped hill in the shadow of Ararat. In the far east of Turkey, there is a quiet valley where one hill looks nothing like the rest. Most slopes are rough and broken, but this ridge is long, smooth, and curved, as if a ship's hull had been pressed into the ground and filled with soil. The ridge lies in Agri province, near the highway that runs toward the Iranian border. It sits above the small village of Uzungili, about 2 miles north of the border, roughly 10 miles southeast of the town of Dogubayazit, and around 18 miles south of the higher peak that most people know as Mount Ararat. The ground here is already high, close to 6,500 feet above sea level, so winters can bury the valley in snow and ice. Seen from above, the outline is clear. The formation stretches for a little over 530 feet from end to end. It narrows to a point at one end like the bow of a ship and widens in the middle before tapering again at the back. Along the sides, you can see low ridges that curve upward, which many visitors describe as ribs. Those numbers matter to many people because they seem to echo the old flood story. In the book of Genesis, Noah's Ark is said to be 300 cubits long. A cubit is an ancient measure based on the length of a person's forearm. If you use a longer cubit, a little under 2 feet long, 300 of them bring you close to the length of the Durupinar ridge. The match is not exact, and experts argue over the details, but the rough similarity has been enough to keep interest alive. Local people say the strange outline was always there in some form, but for a long time it was just part of the background. That changed in the late 1940s, when heavy rain and a series of earthquakes shook the area and stripped off part of the loose mud that had been hiding the shape. A Kurdish shepherd named Reşit Sarehan is often named as the first person to really notice the boat on the ground. At that stage, it was still a local story. Villagers would walk visitors up the slope and show them the ridge. Some saw only an unusual hill. Others felt sure they were looking at something more. The idea that it might be Noah's Ark grew slowly out of talk in homes, in tea houses, and on the rough track that climbed up from the main road. The jump from local curiosity to wider attention began in the autumn of 1959. Captain İlhan Durupinar of the Turkish Air Force was helping with a mapping mission for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. While he was studying aerial photographs of the border area, one image caught his eye. High above Uzungili, there was a clear, sharp shape that looked almost exactly like the outline of a ship. Durupinar reported the find, and the site would eventually take his name. In 1960, the Archaeological Research Foundation sent a small team that included Durupinar, evangelist George Vandeman, and photogrammetry expert Arthur Brandenberger to see the ridge up close. They climbed the slope, paced out the length and width, and looked for anything that might prove the shape was more than rock and soil. They dug test holes into the interior and even used dynamite in some spots. After 2 days, the team announced that they had found nothing but natural material and declared the formation a geological oddity rather than a man-made structure. For many officials and academics, that early verdict seemed to settle the question. The site might have faded back into the background if the story had ended there. Instead, a different kind of visitor began to arrive in the 1970s. Amateur explorer Ron Wyatt, a nurse anesthetist with a strong interest in biblical archaeology, visited the ridge in 1977. He became convinced that this really was the Ark and started to show slides, give talks, and write about it, arguing that the old expedition had missed what was right in front of them. Wyatt's passion drew in other Ark hunters during the 1980s. Former astronaut James Irwin came to look at the formation but left unconvinced. Creationist writer John D. Morris also inspected the ridge and later said he believed it was a natural shape. Even Christians who fully believed the flood story couldn't agree on Durupinar. In 1985, Wyatt returned with salvage expert David Fassold and geophysicist John Baumgartner. Fassold's first impression was that he was standing above the remains of a wrecked ship. He brought along ground radar to send pulses into the soil and a simple device tuned to look for buried metal. Their reports to Turkish authorities said their tools picked up a regular pattern inside the ridge. That claim energized Ark supporters, but also brought strong criticism from geologists, who argued that the methods were not reliable and that the formation still looked like shaped rock rather than a fossilized hull. As news of those expeditions spread, the shape on the hillside turned into a landmark. Articles and books about Noah's Ark began to include photographs of the Durupinar Ridge. Documentary crews from Europe, the United States, and Turkey came to film on site, comparing the outline in the ground with models of ancient ships. The Turkish state also began to treat the hill as something special. In the mid-1980s, as interest grew, the government designated the area around the ridge as a protected part of Mount Ararat National Park and promoted it under the name Noah's Ship. Road signs on the highway near Dogubayazit point drivers toward this formation in the hills. For people in nearby villages, the site slowly became a way to earn a living. Families set up small tea stands and stalls along the dusty track, and local guides led groups up to the ridge, pointing out features on the surface that, in their view, matched ribs, keel, and deck lines. For decades, people had argued while standing on the surface, guessing what might lie below their feet. The real change began when teams came back with instruments that could look under the skin of that boat-shaped hill and start to test those guesses against what was hidden in the rock. Inside the ridge, the wild scan results. When modern scientists went back to the Durupinar Hill, they laid out cables, set up small generators, and dragged low plastic sleds back and forth across the ground. Each sled carried an antenna linked to a machine called Ground Penetrating Radar, or GPR. It sends short bursts of radio energy down into the hill and listens for the echoes that come back. If the waves hit a new layer, a crack, solid rock, or an empty pocket, part of the signal bounces back. A computer measures those echoes and draws them as lines on a screen. When you collect many of those lines side by side, they build up into a picture of the layers hidden under your feet. They also ran another kind of test called electrical resistivity imaging. Here, the team pushed metal stakes into the hill in neat rows and sent a very weak electric current between them. Some ground lets that current move easily. Other rock and soil slow it down. By measuring how hard it is for the current to pass between each pair of stakes, a computer turns the readings into colored blocks on a cross-section. Put a lot of readings together in a line, and you get a slice through the hill, almost like cutting a loaf of bread and looking at the inside. These tools are powerful, but they are not magic. They cannot tell you, this is wood, or this is stone by themselves. They only show changes, boundaries, and shapes. But if those shapes line up in a very neat and regular way, they can hint that something built, not just natural, is buried there. That simple idea is what has kept scientists, university teams, and Ark fans coming back to Durupinar with better gear, year after year. The first time anyone tried radar on this site was back in the late 1980s. Turkish geophysicist Salih Bayraktutan and his team ran early GPR lines along the ridge. Even with equipment that would now be called basic, they reported internal reflections that seemed to form rough layers inside the mound instead of a completely random jumble. The images were fuzzy, and they did not convince everyone, but they showed that the hill was not a simple solid block. Later groups treated those first scans as a starting point and wondered what newer machines might see if they repeated the work. Decades later, private groups and small survey teams came back with updated radar systems. In about 2014 and again in 2019, a geophysical team ran fresh GPR lines over the hill. Reports from those surveys say the radar did not only pick up random streaks. Operators claimed they saw long, straight bands and clear corners starting around 8 feet below the surface and reaching down a little over 20 feet. To them, those patterns looked more like beams, walls, and divisions inside a hull than like the mixed mess you would expect in a simple mudflow. Those hints pushed things to the next level. After about 2020, Turkish universities and international partners agreed to treat Durupinar as a proper study area, not just a curiosity. Istanbul Technical University and Agri Ibrahim Seysin University joined with Andrews University in Michigan. Alongside them, a private project called Noah's Ark Scans, led by researcher Andrew Jones, focused on collecting dense radar and resistivity data and sharing highlights with the media. On a normal field day, the setup was simple but careful. The team painted or flagged straight lanes along the length and width of the ridge. Then they dragged the radar sleds along each line at a steady walking pace, letting the antennas send and receive thousands of pulses every few inches. Each pass added one more thin slice through the hill. Later, in a field tent or lab, software stacked those slices together so the scientists could move through the hill on a laptop screen, scrolling deeper and deeper to see how each bright band or dark gap rose, dipped, or stopped. The three-dimensional GPR work that Noah's Ark Scans has publicized in recent years produced the most eye-catching pictures. When their data were processed, one feature stood out: a long, corridor-like zone running close to the center of the formation. The group describes this as a central hallway more than 200 feet long, with a fairly steady width from one end of the bow to the stern. Off to the sides of that hallway, the images show smaller blocks and sharp-edged shapes that the team interprets as possible rooms or pens. Many of these shapes appear between about 8 and 20 feet down, which is roughly where you might expect decks and compartments if a very large wooden boat had 3 levels inside it. Radar was only half of the picture. The teams also ran long lines of electrical resistivity tests over and around the mound. When they turned the readings into cross-sections, the soil inside the boat shape carried electric current differently from the soil just beyond its edges, as if the inside was made of a different mix of material. When they laid the resistivity results over the radar results, the project team thought the combined picture looked even more organized. The ridge outline formed a smooth, shell-like curve, and the inside showed bands that rose and fell in a steady pattern. Supporters of the arc idea say some of these curves look like ribs in a huge hull, repeated arches running from one side of the ship to the other. They argue that a natural mudflow shouldn't create such neat arches and block-like shapes inside a neat boat-shaped outline. To them, small surface clues seem to support this idea. Drone and satellite images show that grass inside the outline often turns brown or dies earlier in the year than the grass outside it. Turkish reports also note that snow and meltwater sometimes run along the ridge in lines that roughly match the same hull shape seen underground. The team sees these patterns as signs that whatever is under the boat shape is still affecting how water and plant roots move through the soil above it. At the same time, experts who use GPR and resistivity in other places are careful about how much they trust these kinds of images. Geophysicists know that dipping rock layers, thin clay beds, old channels, and even small fractures can all create straight lines, sharp corners, and bright bands on these scans. At Durupinar, most of the detailed data and processing steps have been shared through conferences, news reports, and project websites, not full peer-reviewed papers, so outside scientists can't easily check every part of the model themselves. Still, even careful scientists agree on one thing: the inside of the hill is not simple. To move from shapes to solid answers about what those shapes are made of, The teams had to go beyond images and start grinding tiny samples of dirt and stone in the lab. That is where the story shifts from pictures to chemistry, age, and traces of life locked inside the soil. What the dirt says: chemistry, dating, and traces of life. Once the teams had their scan pictures, they wanted to know something very basic. Is the soil inside that boat-shaped outline any different from the soil right next to it? To find out, they stopped looking at screens and started taking pieces of the hill itself. On the ridge, they marked points across the outline and pushed narrow metal tubes straight down into the ground. Each tube pulled out a thin plug of soil and tiny stones. These cores showed the hill in layers from the surface down several feet. Every sample taken from inside the outline was marked with its exact location and depth, then sealed and stored. Then they did the same thing in normal ground just beyond the outline, so they always had a clean set from inside and a clean set from outside to compare. In the lab, one of the first things they checked was organic matter. Organic matter is just the dark part of soil that comes from dead plants and wood-old roots, bits of bark, and other remains that have broken down into crumbs. If something made of wood sat in one place for a long time and slowly rotted, you would expect the soil there to end up richer in organic matter than ordinary hillside dirt. Tests done in Turkish labs and for the Noah's Ark Scans project showed a clear jump. Soil from inside the boat shape had roughly doubled to almost 3 times as much organic material as soil from the nearby slope. One recent statement said there was about 2.7 times more carbon inside the ship outline than in the soil just outside it. That's not a small difference you can blame on a random patch of grass. It shows that for some reason, more plant material collected and decayed inside the outline than in the soil around it. The teams also measured how much potassium was in the samples. Potassium is a basic plant food that trees and grasses pull from the soil as they grow. When wood and plants rot, some of that potassium leaks back into the dirt around them. Several reports say that soil taken from inside the outline has about 40% more potassium than soil taken from just outside. Soil scientist William Crabtree, who works with the project, has said that when you see higher organic matter, higher potassium, and other changes together in one spot, that is exactly what you expect if a lot of organic material, like wood, has decayed there over a long time. Next, the labs checked pH. pH is a simple scale that tells you how acidic or how alkaline something is. Pure water sits in the middle. Lemon juice is more on the acidic side. Soapy water is more on the alkaline side. Many normal farm soils are close to the middle, which scientists call neutral. When plants and wood rot for centuries in one place, they often release weak acids that slowly push the soil further toward the acidic side. Early tests by Salih Bayraktutan and newer work by joint Turkish-American teams both found the same basic pattern. Soil inside the Durupinar outline is more acidic than soil just outside it. Taken together, those 3 numbers look less like bare mud and more like soil that has lived with a lot of decaying plant or wood material for a very long time. But the story in the samples did not stop with chemistry. When scientists looked closely at the fine grains in their cores, they found thin bands of clay-like material mixed with what they described as marine deposits and even bits of sea life. In some layers from in and around the outline, they reported shell fragments and remains of small sea creatures, the kind of things you usually see in old seafloor mud, not in a dry valley high in the mountains. On its own, that is not as shocking to geologists as it sounds. Eastern Turkey sits in a region where many rocks were first laid down under ancient seas and were later pushed up as the land rose and folded. Because of that, marine fossils and seafloor rocks turn up on ridges and slopes all across this part of Anatolia. From that point of view, clay layers and sea life fossils at Durupinar could simply be part of the normal rock story of the mountains and not a special flood marker on their own. What makes the new work stand out is how some of those clay-rich and organic-rich layers are dated. The main tool behind age estimates is radiocarbon dating. All living things take in a tiny amount of a weak radioactive form of carbon while they are alive. After they die, that special form of carbon slowly breaks down at a steady rate. By measuring how much of it is left in a piece of old plant material or shell, scientists can estimate how long it has been since that piece stopped being part of something alive. Several samples taken from the formation, especially ones with marine traces and higher organic content, have been dated to a window of roughly 3,500 to about 5,000 years ago. That window overlaps with a time many Bible-focused writers suggest for a great flood. But it also fits a broader era that archaeologists call the Chalcolithic period, the time between the late Stone Age and the early Bronze Age, when people in this region were already farming, building villages, and making simple metal tools. In 2023, a joint study by Istanbul Technical University, Agri Ibrahim Sisen University, and Andrews University reported signs of human activity in and around the formation. News coverage said that some rock and soil pieces from the site look like they have been mixed and pressed in ways that match early building or craft work, not just loose natural gravel. Some project members have also spoken about small fragments that may be broken pottery found in and near the outline. They describe these pieces as mixes of clay, sand, and tiny stones that look like recipes for handmade pots rather than random clumps. If later work confirms that these really are pottery shards, it would add one more sign that people were living, working, or at least passing through this part of the valley thousands of years ago. More cautious geologists read the same test results in a very different way. They point out that deep pockets of old soil, buried stands of trees caught by a landslide, or plant-rich layers that built up in hollows can also leave behind dark, acidic, organic-rich zones with higher potassium. Changes in the type of rock under the hill can shift pH too. From that point of view, you do not need a giant ship to explain unusual chemistry. You may only need long-lived plant cover, changing ground, and time. To see why any of this connects to ancient flood traditions, you have to zoom out from one ridge in eastern Turkey and look at the broader region. In southern Iraq, at sites such as Kish, and Shuruppak, archaeologists dug through deep stacks of settlement debris and uncovered sudden layers of clean river mud. At these flood deposits can be as thick as about 10 or 11 feet and sit between earlier and later city levels. They show that powerful floods once rolled across parts of the Mesopotamian plain, destroying homes and streets before new towns were built on top. At Kish and Shuruppak, the layers are thinner, often only a foot of fine clay, but they still point to abrupt, destructive flooding during the early 3rd millennium BC. Shuruppak stands out because later Sumerian tradition remembered it as the hometown of a flood survivor who escaped in a boat. Even if the legends changed over the centuries, they seem rooted in real events. Communities there did experience major floods that left unmistakable traces in the ground. Farther northwest, another attempt to connect geology with old stories appeared in the late 1990s. Two oceanographers, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, proposed that the Black Sea had once been a lower, mostly freshwater lake. In their model, rising Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosporus around 7,600 years ago, sending a massive flow of salt water into the basin and drowning wide stretches of land. Some authors suggested this Black Sea deluge might lie behind later flood traditions. But later research on regional sea levels painted a smaller picture. Studies by geologists and oceanographers found that if such a flood happened, it probably raised the lake only about 5 to 10 meters, not the 50 or 60 meters in the original version, and it covered far less land than early reports implied. Other reviews even question whether a sudden catastrophic flood happened at all. Even so, memories of great floods run throughout the ancient Near East. Mesopotamian clay tablets preserve stories like Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, which describe a divinely sent flood, a chosen man who builds a large boat, animals taken aboard, and a landing on a mountain. Modern scholars note that these accounts and the story of Noah in Genesis share striking details, even though each tradition interprets the event in its own way. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.